Something genuinely seismic just happened in global energy, and the American mainstream press barely paused to cover it. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney walked into Doha, Qatar, sat across from the Emir, and walked out with what could be one of the most consequential energy and investment deals this country has quietly ever been a part of. Not just for Canada, but for the entire architecture of Western energy dependence that Washington has spent decades carefully constructing. And Washington is not happy about it, not happy at all. Because what happened in that room in Doha on January 18, 2026 was not just a trade agreement, it was a declaration. It was Canada saying loudly, clearly, and with full diplomatic ceremony that the age of being Washington's obedient energy vassal is over. And what's remarkable is that most Americans watching cable news that evening had no idea this was happening. While the cameras were pointed elsewhere, a fundamental shift in the global energy order was being signed, sealed, and handed to history. Qatar's sovereign wealth fund committed to making what officials called significant strategic investments in Canadian nation-building projects. And that phrase, nation-building, is not accidental language. It means pipelines, it means LNG terminals, it means AI, defense infrastructure, aerospace, and critical minerals. It means Canada just opened a door to the Gulf that America always assumed it could keep closed. Now let's slow down here and think about what's really going on underneath all of this, because the surface story is only about half of the actual story. The surface story is Canada is diversifying its trade relationships because Donald Trump has been economically aggressive, slapping tariff after tariff on Canadian goods, threatening annexation rhetoric, calling Prime Minister Carney by his first name in a condescending tone and telling Canada that it lives because of the United States. That's the surface, but the deeper story is about something that has been building for years, decades actually, and Trump's tariff war simply accelerated the timeline. The deeper story is about the slow, grinding, irreversible restructuring of who controls the world's energy flows, who controls the pipelines of wealth, and who sits at the head of the table when the global economy makes its decisions. Think about the context for a moment. When Carney flew into Doha, he was completing a trip that had already taken him through China, the first such diplomatic swing by a Canadian Prime Minister in years, and he was on his way to Davos. Connect those three dots. China, Qatar, Davos. That is not a random travel itinerary. That is a man who is consciously and deliberately building a new architecture for Canada's place in the world. And that architecture does not have Washington at its center the way it used to. That's the thing that is making people in certain rooms very uncomfortable right now, and rightfully so, because what Canada is doing is not unique to Canada. It's part of a broader pattern of middle and upper-tier powers quietly reallocating their relationships, their energy contracts, and their strategic loyalties, not because they hate America, but because the America that was reliable, predictable, and rules-based has become something else in the last few years, something more transactional, something more erratic, something that, frankly, the rest of the world is having increasing difficulty planning around. And when countries cannot plan around you, they plan without you. Canada has been positioning itself as a reliable energy partner, seeking to scale up LNG exports to Asian markets through Middle Eastern partnerships, with the Qatar talks focused on securing generational investment from Qatar's sovereign wealth fund for Canadian AI, infrastructure, energy, and defense sectors. Let that sink in. Generational investment. That is not the language of a country that is merely tweaking its trade policy. That is the language of a country that has decided to fundamentally reorient itself and to do it with a partner that sits at the crossroads of global energy, global finance, and global diplomacy. Qatar is not just a gas-rich peninsula in the Gulf. Qatar is one of the most strategically positioned states on the planet. It hosts the largest American military base in the Middle East. It has mediated some of the most complex peace negotiations in recent memory, including talks involving Hamas and Israel, the Taliban and the United States, and various factions across the African continent. Qatar's Al Jazeera network reaches hundreds of millions of people, and Qatar's sovereign wealth fund the Qatar Investment Authority manages hundreds of billions of dollars in assets invested across every corner of the global economy. This is not a small player that Canada just shook hands with. This is a heavyweight. And for Canada to now be calling Qatar a strategic partner and an ally, those were Carney's actual words, rather than just a friendly nation, is a signal that the entire Western bloc of nations needs to sit down and study very carefully. The visit to Doha was the first ever by a sitting Canadian Prime Minister to the state, and upon concluding, the leaders announced a commitment from Qatar to make significant strategic investments in Canadian nation-building projects, investments intended to get major projects built faster, supercharge clean energy, health, AI, and defense industries, and create thousands of high-paying careers. Now, from an American perspective, the question you have to ask is, why does this matter to me, sitting here in the United States? And the answer requires you to understand a few basic things about how American global power actually works in practice. American power is not simply military, it's not simply financial. At its core, in the 21st century, American power rests on its ability to control, or at least heavily influence, the energy flows of the world. Who buys energy from whom, on what terms, priced in what currency, secured through what alliances. For decades, the United States has been the gravity at the center of that system. Its alliance structure, its military presence in the Gulf, its financial system, its dollar, all of these things work together to make Washington the indispensable player in any conversation about global energy. When Europe needed gas after Russia invaded Ukraine, it called Washington. When Asian economies needed LNG, the American export terminals became central to the discussion. The United States positioned itself as not just a producer, but as the organizer of the entire global energy marketplace. What's happening right now is that this organizing function is being challenged, not attacked frontally, not replaced overnight, but challenged, quietly and systematically, by a series of bilateral deals, new partnership frameworks, and sovereign wealth fund investments that are building alternative pipelines, not just physical pipelines, but pipelines of trust, capital, and mutual obligation, that route around Washington. Qatar already meets around 20% of global LNG demand, and offers predictable terms and long horizons for European officials who are weaning themselves off Russian gas and hedging against excessive dependence on American cargoes. And Germany, one of America's closest European allies, has been sending high-level business delegations to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, explicitly looking to diversify away from the political risk that now comes attached to American energy. That political risk is real, it has a name, and that name is unpredictability. Because here's the thing about what Trump's tariff strategy has done to America's global position that rarely gets discussed honestly in public. Every time Trump imposes a new tariff, it contributes to US inflation, creates business uncertainty, and pushes other countries to diversify their trade relationships. So the very tool being used to assert American dominance is, in practice, accelerating the fragmentation of the American-centric global order. Every tariff threat teaches another country's leadership class that depending on Washington is a strategic vulnerability, not a strength. Every time Trump tells a foreign leader that his country lives because of the United States, another sovereign wealth fund manager in Doha, or Abu Dhabi, or Singapore quietly makes a calculation about where to route the next round of infrastructure investment. And that calculation is increasingly concluding that Canada, Australia, parts of Europe, Southeast Asia, these are more stable bets than an America that might wake up tomorrow and decide to impose a 50% tariff with 6 hours' notice. Trump threatened to increase tariffs on Canada to 50% as of January 31st, 2026. And this was not a hypothetical. This was a president of the United States threatening to economically devastate the country that is its largest trading partner, that shares the longest undefended border in the world with it, and that has been its most loyal ally through every major conflict of the modern era. And Canada's response to that threat was to fly its Prime Minister to Beijing, then to Doha, then to Davos. That is a country saying, we are no longer going to organize our entire existence around managing Washington's moods. We are going to build genuine alternatives. And the United States, and the actual American people, not the administration, not the pundits, but the people who work in industries that depend on Canada's raw materials, Canada's energy, Canada's manufacturing supply chain, those people should be paying very close attention to what this means. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick have been explicit. They expect Canada to abandon what they call virtue signaling and align its resources with US energy policy and efforts to force increased NATO spending. Let's think about what that demand actually means in plain language. The United States government is telling a sovereign, democratic nation, a G7 nation, a NATO ally, a country with a larger landmass than the United States itself, what its energy policy should be, and threatening economic punishment if that country fails to comply. And Canada's response to that demand is to sign an investment protection agreement with Qatar, establish a defense attaché in Doha, and begin negotiations on a double taxation agreement to make it easier for Qatari and Canadian capital to flow freely between the two countries. That is not appeasement. That is strategic realignment, and it is happening in real time, right now in 2026, and most Americans are not even aware it is occurring. Qatar's sovereign wealth fund representatives are set to visit Canada to explore new investment opportunities, while a delegation of Canada's leading pension funds is to visit Qatar, with both sides establishing a new commission on economic, commercial, and technical cooperation and identifying co-investment opportunities in artificial intelligence, aerospace, quantum computing, cybersecurity, and information technologies. This is not small bore. Pension funds, sovereign wealth, quantum computing, defense. These are the building blocks of the next industrial era, and Canada is building those blocks with Qatar, not with the United States. Now you might say, well, Canada and the US still do more trade with each other than Canada does with Qatar, and you'd be right. But the point is not the current volume of trade, the point is the trajectory. The point is that relationships are being formed, agreements are being structured, and obligations are being created right now that will shape the trade and investment patterns of the next 20, 30, 40 years. The Qatar Investment Authority does not make small bets. When it puts its capital somewhere, it is making a generational commitment, and it has now committed to making generational investments in Canada. That changes the map, not today, not in a year, but permanently. And here's the broader context that you need to hold in your mind as you think about all of this. Canada is not the only country doing this. This is happening across the entire global system simultaneously. The European Union and Mercosur signed a partnership agreement creating one of the world's biggest free trade zones, and Prime Minister Carney has been advancing new strategic partnerships with China, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia to position Canada in the world as it is, not as we wish it. That phrase, the world as it is, not as we wish it, is important. It is a direct rebuke to the kind of wishful thinking that assumes that because the United States has been the dominant power for so long, it will continue to be. It's a statement that Canada's leadership has looked at the actual geopolitical landscape and has decided to navigate it based on realities rather than on legacy loyalties that are no longer being reciprocated. And the reality of the landscape is this: power is diffusing. The old unipolar moment that followed the end of the Cold War, that moment when Washington was the only game in town, when the dollar was unchallengeable, when American military and economic dominance was simply assumed, that moment is over. It has been over for some time. But we are now entering the period when the consequences of that moment being over are starting to manifest in concrete, visible, irreversible ways. A shift in global oil and gas prospects from Venezuela to Qatar changes the investment outlook for major energy exporters and the big infrastructure projects designed to get resources to overseas markets, with long-term demand remaining an open question as Asia continues to turn to alternative energy sources to power growth. Meanwhile, America is not standing still. The Trump administration's drill, baby, drill strategy is real. American LNG export capacity has been growing, American terminals have been shipping more gas to Europe and Asia, and Washington has been aggressively using trade policy, tariffs, market access, diplomatic pressure to push countries toward buying American energy. Trump's tariffs are pushing East Asian LNG customers toward US suppliers. Major energy importers such as Japan and South Korea are purchasing American rather than Gulf LNG to narrow trade imbalances with the United States. So in some places, the pressure is working. Japan signed an energy commitment as part of its tariff negotiations. South Korea is rerouting some of its LNG contracts. The coercive strategy is producing results in the short term. But here's the problem with coercion as a long-term strategy. It breeds resentment, it breeds the search for alternatives, and it breeds exactly the kind of moves that Canada and Qatar just made in Doha. Every country that feels coerced into buying American energy is simultaneously, quietly behind closed doors, in meetings that don't make the front page, building relationships with Qatar, with the UAE, with Australia, with Norway, with anyone who can provide an alternative. The coercion is producing short-term compliance and long-term realignment. And the long-term realignment is what matters. Because contracts last 20 years, infrastructure lasts 50. Alliances, when they are genuine and mutually beneficial, last generations. The United States is winning some of the immediate skirmishes, but it is losing the longer game, not because America is weak, but because the way America is currently projecting its power is teaching the rest of the world that it needs to have a plan B. And plan B increasingly involves Qatar. It involves China. It involves new frameworks and new partnerships that were unthinkable just 5 years ago. Carney said that after years of stalled negotiations, Canada aims to finalize the investment promotion and protection agreement with Qatar by summer 2026, and Canada will also install a defense attaché in Doha to deepen partnerships on defense. A defense attaché? Think about what that means. Canada is not just trading goods with Qatar. Canada is building a security relationship. It is sharing intelligence. It is engaging in military training. It is inserting itself into the security architecture of a region that the United States has long considered its exclusive domain. And Qatar, remember, is simultaneously hosting the largest American airbase in the Middle East. So you have a situation where a close American ally, Canada, is now building a formal defense relationship with a country that hosts American troops. The geometry of this is not simple. It is not adversarial, but it is genuinely new. And it reflects the fact that the old categories, allies, adversaries, partners, competitors, are becoming less and less useful for describing the actual complexity of how global relationships are organized in 2026. What we are watching in real time is the construction of a multipolar world, not a world where America has lost, not a world where some rival power has simply replaced American hegemony with its own, but a world where many powers, some large, some small, some wealthy, some resource-rich, are weaving a web of mutual dependencies that is far more complex and in many ways more stable than the old hub-and-spoke system centered on Washington. In that web, Canada and Qatar are now nodes, connected to each other, connected to the Gulf's sovereign wealth, connected to Canadian natural resources and engineering capability, connected to Asian markets through LNG and critical mineral supply chains. And that web will continue to grow, will continue to deepen, whether Washington decides to engage constructively with it or not. The most important question for Americans to ask right now is not whether this is good or bad for Canada or good or bad for Qatar. The most important question is, what does it mean for the United States when its closest neighbors and allies begin to systematically build relationships, economic, diplomatic, and military relationships, that no longer route through Washington? What does it mean when the energy architecture that American power has been built on for decades begins to develop genuine alternatives? And what is the right American response to that reality? Because here is the truth that most people in power in Washington are not ready to say out loud. The America that could afford to be indifferent to its allies' concerns, that could afford to use economic coercion as a first resort, that could afford to tell Canada it lives because of us. That America is creating the very alternatives it fears. The tariffs are creating the trade diversification. The unpredictability is creating the new partnerships. The coercion is creating the sovereign wealth fund commitments in Doha and the defense attachés in the Gulf. The United States is not losing its position because its enemies are defeating it. It is losing its position because its behavior is motivating its friends to prepare for a future without it at the center. And that is the real story of what happened in Doha on January 18th, 2026. Not just a trade deal, not just an investment announcement, a signal, clear, deliberate, historically significant. The world heard it. And now, so have you.